I'm sure many of you know how the New Testament Gospels often come under attack from both scholars sometimes and also in particular in the media, and that this often filters through down to the general public as well. The general idea that many people have of the Gospels in the New Testament is that they're sort of myth or perhaps fiction, or if they're trying to be history, they don't do very well and they end up being bad history. Well, my aim in this lecture is really just to set out one plank of evidence for the historical reliability of the Gospels. There are lots of issues that one could tackle in relation to the historical reliability of the Gospels. I'm just going to focus on one particular element. And what I want to do in this lecture is to focus on the geography of the Gospels and try to demonstrate that the geography of the Gospels helps us to see the overall historical reliability of them, to see that they're rooted in real history. Now, one of the reasons why I think it's helpful to focus on geography is that detailed geographical knowledge of a place is hard to fake. And it's especially hard to fake in the ancient world. There were no real atlases. There wasn't Wikipedia or Wikimaps or Wikivoyage or whatever it is, and no Lonely Planet guides that could help you construct a plausible scenario in a foreign country. So if you were trying to present a picture of a place, write an account of what was happening in a foreign country without any detailed eyewitness knowledge, it would be really hard to fake and you'd be bound to get it wrong. Let me tell you something about the genesis of this project that I'm giving to you today, which will end up as a book someday, I hope. I was giving a talk last year to a group of classics students. It was a sort of evangelistic talk in the classics faculty where I used to study myself. The talk was called, "Is Jesus Just Another Hercules?" And in one part I talked about how Jesus is clearly a historical figure in contrast to Hercules, who's a sort of mythical figure, really. And I was pointing out the historical character of the Gospels by comparison with the sort of reports that we hear about Hercules in the ancient world. And one of the things I mentioned in passing was the geography of the Gospels. And I thought, on the morning, just before the lunchtime talk, I thought I'll just have a quick check and see if Josephus mentions any of the places which are referred to in the Gospels in the New Testament. And it was one of those very happy occasions where you expect to find a little bit of evidence, and you actually find masses. I'll talk more about Josephus and who he was later. I was expecting, in addition to the major Old Testament big cities in the Gospels, maybe a couple of other places as well. But I actually found much more confirmation than I actually expected. So what I want to do in this in this lecture is to share with you really what I found absolutely fascinating, that to my surprise, the geography of Jesus' movements in the first century in the Gospels reflects a lot of the way in which the same places that he went to are mentioned in Jewish literature from the time. So what we're looking at here is how the geography of the Gospels is backed up from literature outside the Gospels. Now, I'm not going to focus on archaeology here, but just on discoveries in Jewish literature, and not on individual buildings or anything like that, but specifically on towns. So, on my count, there are 27 towns. Oh, sorry, I have to switch it on. Great. So on my count, there are 27 towns named in the Gospels. And so what I want to do in this lecture is to go through three sort of sets of books. First of all, the Old Testament and the towns that are mentioned, Gospel towns that are mentioned in the Old Testament. Then Josephus, and then rabbinic literature. And then at the end, what I want to do is compare the picture of the geography that we have in the Gospels with some other literature from the time. So, first of all, then, a number of places in the Gospels, as we might expect, are found in the Old Testament. And four of these, in Old Testament times, were really major international cities. Jerusalem, of course, is mentioned hundreds of times in the Old Testament. In addition to the hundreds of mentions in the Old Testament, Jerusalem appears in a massive archive of tablets from the 14th century BC written mainly in the ancient Near Eastern language of Akkadian, and this correspondence is usually referred to as the... Where should I point this to? Where's the... should I point it to you? Point it... There. Great, I'll just wave it around. like a sort of lightsaber. So this is one of the El tablets, which records Jerusalem. And here, a chap called Abdu Heba, who's the prince of Jerusalem, is writing to his boss, Pharaoh, pleading for help because the territory is under threat. And so he wants Pharaoh to come and send him archers to help him against his enemies. This is what he writes. Where's the receiver? Sorry, Alistair.
Are you pressing the right button?
Possibly not, yeah. Sorry. My amazing technical skills, yeah, I'm pressing the wrong button. So, this prince, Abdu Heba, writes, "Look, as for the deed which Milkilu and Shuadata have done to the land of the king, my lord, they've assembled the troops of the city of Geza, the troops of the city of Gath, and the troops of the city of Kilti, and they've seized the town of Rubote. The land of the king has departed to the Apiru men. And now, moreover, a town of the land of Jerusalem, its name being Bit Ninive, a city of the king, has deserted in the wake of the men of the city of Kilti," and so on. So we've got there just one of the many mentions of Jerusalem in the second millennium BC. Centuries later and closer to New Testament times, we get numerous mentions of Jerusalem in classical authors as well. So just a few here. And Pliny the Elder, who's famous for being an eyewitness of the eruption of Vesuvius, which is how we know exactly the day he died on. Pliny the Elder calls Jerusalem... calls it by far the most famous city, not only of Judea, but of the whole of the East. And you, of course, can still see Jerusalem very much today as well. Jericho was not so well known internationally, but it was pretty widely mentioned. The site of Jericho has been rebuilt many, many times over the millennia and centuries, and it's often thought to be the oldest inhabited city in the world. And there are several mentions of it in the... sorry, I'm rushing ahead of my slides. Several mentions of it in ancient authors as well, especially its palm trees. Jericho, the city of palm trees, Jericho with the many palm groves. And here you can see some of those palm trees. Tyre and Sidon, of course, mentioned in the Gospels, the furthest north that Jesus went, often mentioned together in the Old Testament, and as in many other places as well. So they're noted, for example, in those Amarna tablets that I've talked about, and also in various Egyptian papyri. And here's one of those here, and you can see Tyre and Sidon mentioned next to one another in this transcription here, a document from Memphis in Egypt. They appear in a list of places visited by an Egyptian traveller. Bethlehem is well known, of course, in the Old Testament, famous especially as the town of David, where David came from. And its first mention comes in Genesis, and there are many, many other mentions after that. It also appears, some have argued that it appears in the Amarna tablets, but it probably doesn't. What it does appear in is in this ancient clay seal, where it's on that middle line there, which is a bit broken, but seems clearly to mention Bethlehem, an inscription from the 7th century BC. So that's the first mention of Bethlehem outside of the Bible. Ephraim, another town, where Jesus retreats to in John 11, so a rather out-of-the-way place. And it's a bit more obscure in the Old Testament as well, but it seems to be referred to in Kings and Chronicles. Samuel and Chronicles, spelt Ephraim or Ephron in Chronicles. Arimathea is similarly a little bit unclear, but can probably be identified with the town of Ramah, where Samuel came from in the Old Testament, and its Hebrew name is spelt in various different ways, as you can see, Harama or Haramatha or Haramathaim, or in Greek, Armathaim. In Old Testament times, it belonged to Ephraim, belonged to the north, but later in intertestamental times, it's referred to as given to the Judeans down in the south, which is why the Gospel writers, why John refers to it as a Judean town. So this is the first set of Gospel places which one isn't particularly surprised to find in the Old Testament and outside of the Gospels, because they're pretty well-known places. So these are the places which would have been familiar to people, throughout church history before scholars came along and tried to, make clever arguments about them. Now, apart from Tyre in the north, all these towns are near Jerusalem down in the south. I don't know if you can see the detail there, but you can see the focus on the area around Jerusalem. So, of the 27 gospel places that we have in the Gospels, we can tick off 7 to start with: Jerusalem, Jericho, Tyre and Sidon, Bethlehem, Ephraim, and Arimathea. So, and after the Old Testament, these places appear all over the place in Jewish literature later, and in Christian literature as well. So that's the first batch we have of testimony outside of the Gospels to these places. The second group that I want to focus on is the set of places not found in the Old Testament, but found in the Jewish historian Josephus. Now, Josephus was a general during the Jewish war, the revolt against the Romans between 66 and 73 AD. He then, after the war, when he surrendered to the Romans, he then set himself up as a writer in the court of the Roman Empire. And he wrote his own autobiography. He wrote an account of the Jewish war. He wrote a defense of Judaism, and he wrote a history of the Jews. So he was a very prolific author, and so we know quite a lot about Jewish history from this chap Josephus. And Josephus has also been known to Christians down the centuries. So the places that he refers to have also been known to Christians down the centuries, but not like the Old Testament places. The Old Testament places would have been familiar to any Christians who were sitting in church listening to and hearing the Old Testament. But Josephus was only really known among scribes and scholars. So Josephus's place names would have been known down the centuries, but only by the educated elite. He's well known in Christian elite educational circles right the way back into the 2nd century. Theophilus of Antioch in the 170s or 180s already refers to Josephus, and he's quoted throughout church history up to the present day. So, Josephus gives us another 7 gospel place names. First of all, Cana. Now, Cana, despite being a fairly small and insignificant place, has 2 main claims to fame. First, of course, it was the place where Jesus turned water into wine. But secondly, it was also the place where Josephus, for a stretch, during that Jewish war, during that Jewish revolt against the Romans in the 60s and 70s AD, it was his base of operations, and according to his autobiography, it seems like he was there around about AD 66 or 67, that kind of time. And Josephus writes in the course of describing one of the plots against him by his arch rival, John of Giscala, he writes as follows: "Now at this time my abode was in a village of Galilee, which is named Cana." Now, Josephus and John's Gospel agree on the place being Cana in Galilee. So this was another case where I was surprised to find such an obscure little place being mentioned in Josephus as well as in the Gospels. Another surprise, Josephus also goes to Capernaum, where Jesus, of course, lived for much of the time in the Gospels, it seems, and also cast out a demon, healed a paralyzed man, and so on. And Josephus describes in his book on the Jewish War what a lovely place Capernaum was. This is what he writes. It supplies men with the principal fruits, with grapes and figs continually during 10 months of the year, and the rest of the fruits as they become ripe together through the whole year. For besides the good temperature of the air, it's also watered from a most fertile fountain. The people of the country call it Capernaum. So this is a picture of the synagogue, which archaeologists think may be Capernaum today. The light-coloured large bricks on the top are the 4th century synagogue, and the darker coloured bricks on the bottom are from the 1st century synagogue, which the later synagogue was built on top of. So perhaps the synagogue attended by Jesus, if the place is right. Gadara, another place in the Gospels, an important city in the confederation of 10 Greek city-states called the Decapolis. They have a reference to the Decapolis in the Gospels. Gadara features about a dozen times in Josephus' writings, and it's a place of strategic importance. So again, it's another place where we are perhaps not surprised that we might find it outside the Gospels in this case. It's a place of strategic importance. Josephus refers to it as Gadara, the metropolis of Perea, which was a place of strength. So a well-known Greek city. Now, because Josephus is interested in describing the conditions of Judea at the beginning of the revolt, and how things all went wrong, he's very interested in political changes that take place in the cities about which he's writing. So he writes, for example, about the upgrading of a town called Panias into city status, when Philip the Tetrarch, or Philip Herod as he's sometimes called, gives it a connection with the emperor and gives it this upgrade with the name of Caesarea. Oh dear. Yeah, there we are. That's right. Phew. So, when Philip also had built Panias, a city at the fountains of Jordan, he named it Caesarea. And these are the fountains of the Jordan that are mentioned at Caesarea Philippi. Elsewhere, Josephus calls this in the... we just read the first one. Elsewhere, Josephus calls this Caesarea Philippi. About this time it was that Agrippa built Caesarea Philippi larger than it was before. There you have the same name as is used in the Gospels. It's called Caesarea Philippi to distinguish it from the more well-known Caesarea on the coast that's mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. Now, this first passage in Josephus about Caesarea Philippi goes on to talk about Bethsaida as well, the hometown of Simon Peter and his brother Andrew, and where Jesus heals a blind man, for example. Bethsaida is an interesting case. In the Gospels, Mark calls Bethsaida a village, but Matthew, Luke, and John call Bethsaida a town, or possibly even a city, the word can mean. So how can it be that Mark refers to Bethsaida as a village, but Matthew, Luke, and John refer to it as a city? Well, Josephus provides one possible answer to this question. He writes as follows. When Philip also had built... Oh, yes, the first bit is just the Caesarea Philippi bit. When Philip also had built Panias, a city at the fountains of Jordan, he named it Caesarea, he also advanced the village of Bethsaida, located at the lake of Gennesaret, to the dignity of a city, both by the number of inhabitants it contained and its other grandeur, and called it by the name of Julias, the same name as Caesar's daughter. So how can Bethsaida be both a village and a city at the same time? Well, the answer is perhaps provided by Josephus, because it started out as a village, but then was upgraded to the status of a city, according to Josephus. Then there's Tiberias. Now, it's one of the surprising things that Tiberias hardly features at all in the Gospels. Jesus never seemed, well, at least as far as we know from the Gospels, Jesus never went there. Crowds of people come to him from Tiberias, according to the Gospels, but it's not a very significant place in Jesus' journeys. It's a very important city. It minted its own coins, as you can see here, a coin with Tiberias written in the middle. And it's mentioned by pagan authors like Ptolemy the geographer and Pliny as well. And it appears a lot in Josephus. And the first reference in Josephus is where he describes Herod Antipas's foundation of the town. Herod Antipas, the Herod, during the time of Jesus' ministry. So he writes as follows. And now Herod the Tetrarch, who was in great favour with Tiberius the emperor, built a city of the same name with him and called it Tiberias. He built it in the best part of Galilee, at the lake of Gennesaret. There are warm baths at a little distance from it, in a village named Emmaus. So we've got Tiberias there, and we also got at the end a reference to an Emmaus. But this Emmaus, of course, is in Galilee. So, it's not likely to be the same Emmaus as the one which Jesus visited shortly after his resurrection. That's a different Emmaus, this one here, which is also mentioned in Josephus. So that's the Emperor Vespasian, at the end of the Jewish war, founded no city there, but reserved the country for himself. However, he assigned a place for 800 men only, whom he had dismissed from his army, which he gave them for their habitation. It's called Emmaus and is about 8 miles from Jerusalem. Now, this fits much better with the location of where Jesus famously, of course, spoke to the disciples on the Emmaus Road. So, in addition to what we had from the Old Testament, the 7 places there, Josephus adds another stock of places, especially up in around Galilee, which was where he was sort of the key player in the Jewish war, where his military bases were. And these aren't touched on so much in the Old Testament, partly because many of them hadn't been built at the time of the Old Testament, places like Tiberias, for example. So in addition to what we had from the Old Testament, these places, Josephus gives us another 7 places. They're coming. Yeah, great. So that's where we're up to so far. Moving on from Josephus, there's further evidence for gospel places in the literature of the ancient rabbis as well. Now, unlike the Old Testament, being well known to Christians down the ages, and Josephus being well known to sort of Christian scholars at least down the ages, Christians up until really quite late on really knew nothing at all about the rabbinic writings, the writings of the ancient Jewish rabbis from the century, from the sort of 2nd century onwards. It was written in difficult Hebrew and Aramaic. Hardly any Christians knew Hebrew in the Middle Ages. Some church dignitaries said there's no use in learning Hebrew. Augustine got along perfectly well without it. So why do you want to bother with that? Or others said there's nothing wrong with it. It's just pointless. Yes, just harmless fun. It wasn't until rabbinic literature started being printed in the 16th century that Christian scholars started to be able to engage with it and analyse it. And one of the first places noted as appearing lots and lots of times in rabbinic literature is the town of Bethphage. Remember, on the Mount of Olives here. This is the Mount of Olives. I don't think Bethphage has been excavated, but it's somewhere on there. Now, the Mishnah, which is the earliest rabbinic legal text from around AD 200, the Mishnah refers at one point to the different interpretations of this rather obscure stuff sometimes, in different interpretations of Leviticus 23 and 24, and specifically about how the showbread, the bread that's supposed to be on the table always before the Lord in the temple, how that should be baked, and also how the wave offerings for the first fruits should be baked as well. So this is the general view of, first of all, the general view of how they should be baked. The 2 loaves and the showbread were alike in that they were kneaded and rolled outside. You prepare the bread outside the temple court and bake it inside. So that's the general view. On the other hand, there's then a minority view, which is stricter than that, No, Rabbi Judah says they were wholly prepared inside the temple court. And then another minority view, which took a more lenient line, Rabbi Simeon says it was always the custom to say the 2 loaves and the showbread were valid whether they were made in the temple court or in Bethphage. So it doesn't even have to be prepared inside the temple courts or baked inside the temple courts. The whole thing can take place even outside of the city limits understood, or within the city limits if you include Bethphage and the Mount of Olives inside the city of Jerusalem. So Rabbi Simeon's making a pretty generous ruling here, declaring that for the purposes of this ritual, Bethphage is sort of part of the city of Jerusalem. Now, just before this passage in the Mishnah, there's a discussion of where the first fruits of the harvest can come from. Now, you want the first fruits, the bread of the first fruits, to arrive pretty fresh, ideally, rather than just stale. And so, ideally, you'd want it to come from Jerusalem, but that's not always possible. So this is what we have in where the first sheaves of grain can come from. The best fulfillment of the commandment of the Omer, that's the first sheaf of the first lot of grain from the harvest. The best fulfillment of the commandment of the first fruits is that it come from a nearby land. If the areas close to Jerusalem were not yet ripe, they could bring it from any place. It once even happened that it came from Gathercole, and that the 2 loaves came from the valley of Ein Sychar. Now, this Ein Sychar, or Ein Soker, is almost certainly the Sychar of John's Gospel, the place where where Jesus encounters the woman at the well. And Ein Sychar means well or spring of Sychar. And as the Mishnah implies, Ein Sychar or Ein Soker is quite a long way away from Jerusalem, and of course that we know from John's Gospel that it's in Samaria, it's the Samaritan town. So this is the contribution of the Mishnah, 2 additional places, Bethphage and Sychar. The compilation of the Mishnah, though, this first bit of big rabbinic legal textbook, is then supplemented by a body of texts called the Tosefta, which just means the additions. So it's a sort of supplementary volume. And in the Tosefta, we learn that there's not just a lake called Gennesaret, it's another name for the Sea of Galilee, not just a lake called Gennesaret, but actually a town called Gennesaret as well, which is where Jesus and his disciples land after Jesus has walked on the water. Now, I need to explain something here. According to Jewish law, we were talking about this with the students earlier. According to the Jewish law, one thing that you're not allowed to do on the Sabbath is work, of course. And one of the things that counts as work is moving something from one place, one domain, to another. And in the Tosefta, people are wrestling with this problem. It's a bit inconvenient if you can't move things from one place to another. So one of the fine legal minds of the time works out a way where you can do it. That's what lawyers do, isn't it? Now, what you do in order to get round this and be able to move one thing from one place to another is to turn the 2 places into one place. Now, and then you're just moving it around your own living room. So let me illustrate this. You start off with 2 separate houses, okay? Person A's house and person B's house with public space in between. Now, you can't move stuff from... Person A can't move his stuff into person B's house. But if the owners both open their gates and join them together like this, then what you have is just one domain which you can then move stuff around in. I'm grateful to the website of Stand Guard Security Systems for the picture of the gates. So let's look at the way the Tosefta describes this case. The sages concede to Rabbi Yehuda in the case of Gennesar that if person A opens the gate of his enclosed area and closes off the public domain, and person B opens the gate of his enclosed area and closes off the public domain, then they prepare an eruv, that's a joining up of 2 separate spaces, so that they may carry or set objects in the centre of the enclosed space. So the Tosefta gives us one more place then, Gennesar or Gennesaret, somewhere on the plain of Gennesaret here around the Sea of Galilee. Now, after the Mishnah and the Tosefta, we have the next layer of rabbinic legal commentary, which is the Talmud. Two Talmuds, actually, and the Talmud from Babylonia is the main sort of authority book for Jews still today. So with Chorazin, the place where Jesus pronounced a woe on at one point, we're back in the realms of how the bread for the Levitical offerings should be baked, should be prepared. So what we've got here, come and hear. Rabbi Yosef said, they would have brought it even from the wheat of Karzaim, or Chorazin, and of Kephar Achim, if only they had been nearer to Jerusalem. So what has Chorazin got going for it? Well, they've got good sort of bread there, good sort of wheat, and they prepare it in the right way, but it's just a little bit too far away. It's up in Galilee. It's a little bit too far away from Jerusalem for the bread to be valid for the offering. Also in Galilee is the town of Mary Magdala. Now, Magdala in the Talmud is called Migdal Nunaya. That's the Tower of the Fishes. And it's said to be a mile away from Tiberias here. So, said Rabbi Abahu in the name of Rabbi Simeon ben Lachish, the period for fermentation, in other words, how long it takes to leaven the bread, the period of fermentation is as long as it takes a man to walk from Migdal Nunaya to Tiberias, which is a mile. In other words, if you leave dough out for 20 minutes, that'll be long enough for it to leaven. So we now leave the realm of legal discussion and move into the realm of biblical commentary. So this is from part of the commentary, the great commentary on Genesis, Genesis 49:19, where we have the verse, Issachar is a strong donkey crouching between the sheepfolds. Now you might think, what comment can be made about that? Well, quite a lot, as it turns out. Issachar is a strong donkey. Like a donkey is lower on both its sides, but is upraised in the middle, so there is in Issachar a valley on both sides, and in the middle, mountains. Crouching between the sheepfolds, this refers to the two valleys. And he saw that rest was good. This is Tina'am, and the land that it was pleasant. In Hebrew, Na'amah. So there's a play on words here. The land was pleasant, and this is Naim, which is another way of spelling Nain in the Gospels, where the widow of Nain is from. Now, this is from Genesis Rabbah, the great commentary from the big sort of giant commentary series like you see in Christ College Library. But there are also smaller sets of commentaries from which Jews wrote in the Middle Ages as well and late antiquity. And this is from a smaller commentary on the Song of Songs. And this supplies us with another place name. Rabbi Nehemiah said, when the Holy One, blessed be he, shows Israel the grave of Gog and Magog, behold, the feet of the Shekinah, that's the presence of God, the dwelling of God, will be upon the Mount of Olives, and the grave of Gog and Magog will be open from the south of the Kidron Valley to Gergeshta, on the east of the Sea of Tiberias. Now, Gergeshta, or Gergesa, here, is probably the correct reading of Matthew for the location where Jesus cast out the demons and sent them into the pigs in Gergesa. And again, the location is in agreement with the Gospels, as it says here, Gergeshta, on the east of the Sea of Tiberias. Now, this manuscript was only first published in the 19th century and only began to be applied to Gospel studies, to the geography of the Gospels in the 1970s. So there are lots of new discoveries being made all the time about these places. Now, one place which you may have noticed has been absent so far is Nazareth. Now, Nazareth wasn't known as being referred to in Jewish literature, wasn't known by Christians until the 20th century. A poem was first published mentioning Nazareth, a poem by a rabbinic poet, wasn't published until 1909 for the first time, and then the first inscription which mentioned Nazareth, a Jewish inscription in Hebrew, was first published in 1962. So it's only very recently that we've started to know about evidence for Nazareth in Jewish literature. And you can see 2 lines from a poem here. Nations thou shalt crush with afflicting plagues, over Nazareth may you renew your glance. That's from a poet called Hadutha. And then Nazareth is one of the list of places in this inscription here. The 17th course, this is a reference to where communities of priests lived. The 17th course of priests of Hezir lived in Mamliach. The 18th course of priests of Hapizes lived in Nazareth, and so on. So, after the 7 places that we have in the Old Testament, 7 places in Josephus, we have various others referred to from all over the place across the land of Israel, and with 8 more in total. Bethphage, Sychar, Gennesaret, Chorazin, Magdala, Nain, Gergesa, and Nazareth. So that makes a total of 22 out of 27 gospel places being referred to in Jewish literature outside of the New Testament. What I want to do finally, and we're near the end now, don't worry, don't feel like you have to try and escape somehow. What I want to do is to try and see how this statistic fares. What sort of is this a good? Is 22 out of 27 a good score or a bad score? So what I want to do is compare this statistic with what we have in other literature. So first, comparison. For my first comparison, I want to return to the Jewish historian Josephus. Josephus is quite a good sort of person to compare with the Gospels, I think, partly because he's from the same time frame. Josephus is writing in the second half of the 1st century, between a few years later than some of the New Testament writers, writing between about 70 and 100. But he's roughly from the same time frame. Also, the particular work that I'm going to pick from Josephus is one which is the same length, roughly, as the Gospels, Josephus' autobiography. And I think the other reason why Josephus and his autobiography is a good text to compare with the Gospels is because Josephus, as a general in Galilee, moved around a lot, and so we have lots of references to place names in this life of Josephus. He wasn't an itinerant preacher, but as a general, he was constantly called upon to inspect various places and so on. So what do we find when we look at Josephus and how many place names he has? Well, he has a whopping 44 places in his autobiography. He clearly thought it was very important to refer to lots of places, even though he was writing for an audience of Romans, in some ways writing just like the gospel writers were, writing for people who would never have heard of these places, but nevertheless saw it as significant to record the locations. Now, of Josephus' 44 places, I think I'm being fair and generous in saying that out of these 44, 35 of them are referred to in Jewish and Christian literature elsewhere. So 35 are mentioned and 9 are not known from elsewhere. So with the Gospels, then, we have 22 out of 27, and that's a percentage of 81%. And with Josephus, we have 35 out of 44, which is a rough percentage of 80%. So overall, then, the Gospel writers and Josephus have almost exactly the same level of place names which are known from elsewhere. In fact, if you separate the Gospels out individually, they end up with even higher percentages. Now, I think that sort of comparison and the almost identical percentage in the Gospels and Josephus is significant because no one doubts for a moment that Josephus was an eyewitness of the events of the Jewish war and that he really knew Galilee like the back of his hand, and he's referring accurately to geography. He wasn't a native he wrote his books in Rome, but he was a native of Judea and spent many years, especially during the revolt in Galilee. So that's my first comparison. As a second kind of comparison, I want to draw in evidence of a very different kind. When we compare the Gospels and Josephus, I think what we see is the similarity between them, What I want to do in the second comparison is briefly to compare the geography of the New Testament Gospels with the geography of the apocryphal Gospels, the Gospels outside of the New Testament. And the first thing that one notices about these texts is that there's little or no geographical detail at all. So, as an early commentator, one of the first people to study the Gospel of Truth noted, it never names any country or city or other geographical entity, end quote. The same is true of the Gospel of Mary, although we can't rest too much on that because the Gospel of Mary only survives in fragments. In the Gospels of Thomas and Judas and Philip, we have hardly any references to Jesus being in specific places. They only have Jesus turning up in geographical locations described in a very general way. So, of the two places mentioned in Thomas and Judas are the world and Judea. And in the Gospel of Philip, it's just the world and Jerusalem. So, as I'm sure you'll agree, it's not exactly pinpoint accuracy here. The second point to note about the apocryphal Gospels is that when they do mention place names, as some of them do, they often make a bit of a hash of it. And you can see this secondly. So, for example, the Sophia of Jesus Christ, which is often referred to as a gospel sort of text, refers to the Mount of Olives being in Galilee, which is about 70 miles away from where it actually is. You have this statement, in Galilee on the mountain called Olivet. In the infancy Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is born in our region of Bethlehem in the town of Nazareth. So again, a sort of a conflation of Bethlehem, which is down in the south near Jerusalem, and Nazareth, which is up in the north near the Sea of Galilee. So again, about 70 miles away. In the Gospel of Barnabas, Jesus sailed to his city of Nazareth. If you've ever been around Nazareth, you'll know that it's a bit difficult to sail around there. As the people who first edited the text of the Gospel of Barnabas put it, this apostle who had wandered up and down with his master through the whole length of Palestine from Damascus and Caesarea Philippi to Mount Sinai is apparently of the opinion that one can sail by boat to Nazareth. Finally, in the reference to Jerusalem in the Gospel of Philip that I mentioned earlier, there's a remark about the parts of the temple. It goes as follows. There were 3 buildings specifically for sacrifice in Jerusalem. The one facing the west was called the Holy, another facing south was called the Holy of the Holy, and the third facing east was called the Holy of the Holies, the place where only the high priest enters. Now, all this stuff about parts of the temple facing east, south, and west is just plain bonkers, really. And there was one commentator of the, on the Gospel of Philip who really liked it and was a bit of a Gnostic, really, a Gnostic scholar. He nevertheless calls this an irritatingly unrealistic topography of the temple. And one can multiply examples like this from the apocryphal Gospels. But what it illustrates, I think, is that this is what happens if you try to write a gospel without proper knowledge, without eyewitness testimony from real eyewitnesses of the place, without proper knowledge of the geography. It's hard to fake accurate geography, especially in the ancient world. And if you try, you inevitably get it wrong. So the New Testament writers couldn't possibly have got these details about the geography right without eyewitness knowledge or eyewitness testimony from others. So, to conclude. In conclusion, then, scholars have so far found in the Old Testament and in Jewish literature outside of the Bible, 22 out of 27 of the towns mentioned in the Gospels. So the five at the bottom there are unaccounted for. But even in these cases, most of them have got Semitic-sounding names in the form that they survive in, and some are actually known place names in the other literature, but we just can't be sure whether these are the places which are the same places as the ones referred to in the Gospels. Richard Borkham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which I'd very much recommend to anyone who's interested in the study of the historical reliability of the Gospels, Richard Borkham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, has shown that the pattern of personal names, people's names, as we can see it in Judaism, fits remarkably accurately the pattern of what people were called in the Gospels. And I think just as the pattern of personal names, as Borkham shows, fits the pattern in the Gospels, I think the same, what I've aimed to show today, that the place names that we find in the Gospels also fit what we know of first century Palestine. On the other hand, when we compare the New Testament Gospels with those Gospels outside of the Bible, we can see even more clearly, I think, how remarkable the level of detail is that we find in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Let me finish with a quotation from one of the most eminent ancient historians alive today, Professor Sir Fergus Miller of Oxford University. He writes as follows: "The Gospels provide an extremely vivid and, in geographical terms, quite extensive view of what the area of Jewish settlement was in Jesus' time." Thank you very much for listening.